Empires East and West. This is the third main lecture, um, or actually fourth lecture overall for this semester. Um, and in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the Roman Empire, really its end and its division between East and West, and how Europe, the origins of Europe's development from there. Now, for a time, Constantine reestablished the Roman Empire. Um, by the end of the 4th century, uh, it was clear that a single administration couldn't effectively run the the state of the empire. The empire was too big, too unwieldy. So, not long after Constantine, it was deemed that necessary that the Roman Empire should be divided into two parts. So Theodosius I splits the empire back into eastern and western portions. And so this lecture will cover how those two halves of the empire developed in their own ways. First, starting off with the Eastern Roman Empire, what made the Eastern Roman Empire distinctive from its counterpart in the West? Well, first off, the Eastern Roman Empire is commonly referred to as the Byzantine Empire today, due to the people that lived in the capital city of what we know as the Byzantine Empire, which historically had always been known as Byzantium. It was actually renamed Constantinople after Constantine, who established a city there. Well, the people who lived in the Byzantine Empire always thought of themselves as being part of the Roman Empire. Now, this portion of the Roman Empire was stronger and it was wealthier. Going back to Constantine, the wealth shifted there when Constantine made Constantinople his center of power, where he would actually govern from. That shifted a lot of the wealth, a lot of the commerce started shifting over there and away from the city of Rome. Rome became marginalized. And so with that, not only that, but the fact that Constantinople sits along trade routes that connect it with Europe and Asia and Africa. Now, one of the reasons the Eastern Roman Empire also flourishes has to do with geographic location. The general path of the barbarian migrations or invasions was a little bit further north. There were also more rugged terrain to the north of Constantinople. There were some incursions that came close, but where Constantinople sits, it sits essentially on a peninsula, and so there were actually walls built up. And again, because of the wealth, those walls were well maintained. Not only that, but there was also a very well-maintained military that had the money for that. Whereas in the Western Roman Empire, there weren't really many walls at all along the frontier. And geographically, there were a lot of access points in the empire. And there was no money to maintain a standing army. Instead, you end up with a military that is formed by a number of mercenary groups, usually different Germanic tribes. And then this becomes a bit of a problem because since they don't have the money, oftentimes these nomadic tribes decide, well, if you're not going to pay us, we're going to take it from you. And so a number of cities would oftentimes be sacked and pillaged. So again, there were a couple of later invasions in the 6th century, or attempts to attack, and again, they thwarted these attacks. So they had, again, money to maintain their military, money to maintain the walls. They sat at really at the crossroads of trade routes that connected them, or connected Europe to Asia and Africa. And so they were really in a beneficial position. And because Constantine had shifted things eastward, made Byzantium his center of power, which again was renamed Constantinople, that shifts the wealth. And so the wealth goes over to the Byzantine Empire as well. As far as government culture are concerned, Justinian, Emperor Justinian, really probably the greatest emperor in the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire, revitalized the use of Roman law. He brought it back. And he definitely solidified the position that Byzantine rulers took in relationship to the church. Emperors were the heads of the Christian church in the East, just as the first emperors of Rome, of the Roman Empire, were the chief priests of the traditional Roman religion. So in many ways, the Eastern Roman Empire preserved more aspects of traditional Rome than what existed in the West. In addition to this, scholars continue to use Greco-Roman philosophy as the foundations for education in the East. So what you have in the East is a wealthier empire where there's a definite unification of church and state, where the emperor is not just the chief of state, but they're also the head of the church. And you have a number of institutions from the Roman Empire that are preserved in that empire. Now, the Western Roman Empire. Well, what happens to the Western Europe in the wake of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire? It's here we're going to see more of a break with Roman traditions. In the West, there's going to be a lot of influence from the various Germanic tribes, and many of these tribes are going to bring about their own institutions, their own traditions, their own law, which will be mixed with Roman law, with Christianity as well. Oftentimes, some of these Germanic tribes will bring in some more brutal practices when it comes to dealing with lawbreakers. In any case, the Germanic tribes bring their own traditions, and the Germanic tribes will affect the Western Roman Empire in that one Germanic king by the name of Odoacer will depose the last emperor of Rome in 476. At least that's the traditional date given for the fall of the Roman Empire. As I said earlier, the Byzantine Empire, the people who lived in that empire believed they were Romans right up to the very end in 1453. So really what we have are two different Roman empires. But because the Western Roman Empire possesses the city of Rome, the last emperor sitting on the throne of the Roman Empire in Rome was deposed in 476 by a Germanic king. Now, what does this do for religion in the West? Well, it's going to fragment. First off, secular authority will be fragmented. There will be no secular leadership in the West other than the Germanic kings. There will be only one person left with authority over the great mass of people in the West. Yes, you have each of the Germanic kings, but those kings aren't united as much as the one factor that does unite the people of the West, and that's Christianity. Um, and all of those Christians have one thing in common. There's the Bishop of Rome, who is um, we know as the Pope. Now, the Bishop of Rome could claim that his authority came from Christ's apostles. He was one of just a select group of 12 that could claim this, the others all being in the Eastern Roman Empire. Uh, the Eastern bishops could make this claim, and they could make the claim that they were equals to the Bishop of Rome, but the ones that were in the Eastern Roman Empire were under the authority of the emperor. But the Pope was not under the authority of anyone. There was no one left above the Pope. And there were no bishops in the West who could claim authority, claim that their authority came from Christ's apostles. And so, in this case, what happens is the Pope takes a greater role in the development of Christianity in the West. The other bishops in the West, the lesser bishops, they essentially become kind of regional leaders, provincial governors. They have many of the same roles provincial governors would have. The Pope starts sending missionaries to Northern and Western Europe. The Germanic kings come to recognize the superiority of the Pope over the Church upon conversion, and so now we see this division as the Germanic kings are the leaders of the state, and the Pope is the leader of the Church. And the Germanic kings acknowledge this upon their conversion. But this isn't without its conflicts later on in the Middle Ages. There'll be continuous conflicts, especially among more and more powerful kings who will butt heads with the church. And there'll be this ongoing competition between kings and the church for who has power, who has more power over the people, and who has secular authority and who has religious authority. And you'll actually have both the church and the state groups, the Germanic kings and the Pope, continually trying to assert authority over both of these things. Now, the Germanic kingdoms, what role do Germanic peoples have in the shaping of Western Europe? Well, again, as I said, they have their own traditions, their own, for instance, laws, trial by pain being one in particular. And this isn't something that's just solely something that comes from the Germanic peoples. This can be found in other societies as well. But for instance, one type of punishment, if you were presumed to be guilty of a crime, you might be asked to grab a rock out of a boiling pot with boiling water. You might be asked to grab a rock out of it, and then you would obviously have a severe burn on your hand. They would wrap your arm, and if things looked worse after a couple of days, you were presumed guilty of that crime. That was basically the types of punishment that existed in or among these Germanic tribes. And in some cases, these Germanic tribes took other things as well. They oftentimes had a violent way of approaching things. The church had typically tried to spread their faith in peaceful ways to minister to people. Germanic tribes saw themselves as more of warriors for God, and so they took it upon themselves to convert people by force, and basically by the sword. You will convert or you'll perish, and that was really something that guided Christianity in the West through much of the Middle Ages. Um, when the Roman Empire falls, roads, cities, and other institutions crumble, and what you're left are the ruins that serve as constant reminders that once upon a time there was a great society there, not just for the people but for even the leaders. And so what happens is the Germanic leaders and the Germanic peoples, they learn to revere the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire becomes something to aspire to, and this really influences Western Europe. It influences their mindset. And of course, a similar influence will also be seen in the East as well. And this is going to be something that'll be an ongoing theme throughout European history, even going up till today. Reasons why things are done is because the Romans did it, whether they're talking about the Republic or the Empire. Christianization of Germanic kingdoms helped spread knowledge of Roman education and institutions. It was actually Christian monks who preserved a lot of the learnings. And of course, those things would be passed on through conversion as well. And they would be passed on to the Germanic tribes that came into the area. Rome couldn't be restored, but Rome gets upheld as an example, as an ideal. And that is it for this lecture. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them on the general discussion board in the general files folder of our classroom page.